Welcome, I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate. Later on in the program, we're going to talk about transportation funding. But first, Colorado is home to something rather unique called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And people don't seem to understand it all that well. So I thought we'd take a look at the history and what it means today from the Independence Institute. Rob Natelson, who is our constitutional expert, thank you for being here.
Good to be here.
And the man who was there from the very beginning of TABOR, Fred Holden. Glad to have you. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
All right. TABOR passed in 1992. And it was Amendment 1 back then.
That's right.
Because apparently there was no other amendment before that. It was the first ever amendment. And I'm just curious, what led to it? Why? Help me remember, because I remember the celebration, I remember the work for it, but it wasn't the first shot at something that would limit tax expenditures and tax collections and also give people the right to weigh in on tax increases.
Well, probably the first thing that made it possible was the passage of Proposition 13 in California. And in 1986, two people from Palisade, John and Diane Cox, came forward and said, we just need a way to control taxes so the people can control them. So they came out with a very simple amendment that says you can't raise our taxes unless the people vote on it.
This was Proposition 13?
No, that time was, no.
Well, what was 13 in California? Remind me.
Well, it had to do with controlling property taxes because they were going through the roof.
Was that Howard Jarvis?
Howard Jarvis.
All right, and so that was one of the first times that state...
It was a door opener.
Right, the people stood up, used the initiative process and said, you guys in office, you might be Republicans, you might be Democrats, but you need some adult supervision. You can't do this without some permission. And so Colorado felt the same way. Why was that feeling brewing in the late 80s?
I think it's been latent since government invented taxes. But I think that opened the door that said, oh, gosh, we can do that. And those two people came out with, it was Amendment 4 at the time. And I'll make it real quick, it failed. It got only 37% yes. And then after that, in 1987, the Colorado Union of Taxpayers had a big meeting. I called it a commiseration. There were about 30 people there. Who's going to do the next amendment and what will it be? And there were about 30 people there, and they broke up into about 4 or 5 committees, and one of them was rewriting the amendment. So I thought, I'll sit in that one. So I sat there, and I ended up being the chairman. I said, I will only be chairman if you guys, and they were all men, if you men stick with me. So we had a few meetings and attendance went off. But during that time, there were a few faithful, and this new guy came in. He says, I'm from Southern California, and he laid one on the table. And then we discussed it. It's kind of interesting because we discussed it, and there were 2 factions. There was a Northern Colorado and a Southern Colorado faction. Each one was trying to set up tax control for them, for their businesses. Right. And all of us resigned. Didn't even talk to each other. There were 5 of us. And unknown to any of them, we came back together in 6 weeks. And that was the TABOR committee. And Douglas Bruce was a part of it. And I've documented some of that in some of my writings. But anyway, then in 1988, the first one came through. And this is an interesting part. Douglas Bruce had, if there was any change, increase in taxes or fees,
all right,
it had to be voted on. And so they came out with the very simple thing, oh, do you mean at the University of Colorado, if they want to change a towel fee from $2 to $3.50, you have to have the whole state vote on it? Well, then
that's why it failed in 1990.
Okay, now you need some numbers. Right there, it passed by only 43%. So in 1990, Douglas Bruce took it all and changed it to everything they were saying. It almost passed. It went by 49.5%. And they were saying, we got him.
All right, let me go over here and talk about what exactly is this? By the way, you put together a Colorado Taxpayers Bill of Rights. This is available at Independence Institute. It's the history, it's the why, it's the where, and what needs to be done with it, the effect. So from your constitutional point of view, what is special about Colorado's Citizens Initiative that brought us this? What is special about TABOR?
Well, you know, actually, John, I'm going to disagree with you, something you said a minute. It's not at all unique.
Really?
Right, and that's one thing that I think both the friends and the enemies of TABOR say that's not correct. There's a very long history in America, in our federal Constitution, in an overwhelming number of our state constitutions, of limiting the fiscal power of the legislature, of saying there are certain things that the legislature cannot do. And TABOR was passed in part because the original Colorado Constitution, passed back in 1876, had a number of measures to control spending and taxes and debt, and the courts over the years watered them down. And
whoa, time out there.
Yeah.
So everything old is new again.
Yeah,
How fascinating.
It's exactly. I mean, the idea of the citizens passing something and the courts watering it down, the citizens pass, and this goes on not just in Colorado, it goes on in every state of the country with the possible exception of Vermont, and quite a number of states have tax and expenditure limitations, some as comprehensive as TABOR.
But there was some already in the Colorado Constitution before the courts?
Oh yeah, there were restrictions, for example, on debt. There was restriction on property taxes. Over the years, those measures were watered down. And so one of the lessons that activists like Doug Bruce learned is that if you want to cure the problem, you probably can't cure it forever, but you need to have the most comprehensive measure you can, the clearest measure you can, and you need to close a lot of the loopholes that people use in order to get around these measures.
I just find it fascinating because the TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, that is in force today, you know, some 25 years after it was passed, is a skeleton of the original TABOR. Solely because of the court eviscerating it and rewriting it with so many rulings.
Not just solely the courts, because the people have passed a number of initiatives. For example, when we legalized marijuana and established a marijuana tax, the voters said that that was exempt from TABOR. We've passed a number of different measures, rightly or wrongly, that exempt income streams from TABOR. But you're right that most of the evisceration has come from the courts, and particularly the Colorado Supreme Court. And I would say the Colorado Supreme Court's not alone or even the worst offender in this regard.
Oh my God, that is the saddest thing I've ever heard.
It is sad. It's very sad.
Well, don't let that out publicly.
Yeah. But the fact is that the courts have been undeniably hostile to TABOR, and if you catch the friends of the court in an unguarded moment, they'll admit it too.
Well, people might be wondering, what the hell are we talking about? Because for those of us who are old-timers in this, I mean, we understand TABOR. We've been trying to defend TABOR. There's a whole bunch of the Takings Coalition that is dead set on weakening it, and they've done an incredible job over this quarter of a century. But what exactly did TABOR do? In the most simple terms, how would you explain TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights?
I would explain it with two words, public and private. The private sector, that's business, commerce, industry, business, that's entrepreneurs, small business, is what funds government. If you have a powerful private sector, they'll generate a lot of jobs and a lot of taxes, and that goes to government. But in doing that, they hire a lot of people, and they have something to do, so it actually reduces the burden on government. And I said in my book, smart governments would be very powerful governments and rich governments, because if they do it right, they'll get lots of money and not have much to do with it. But they're greedy. They, as a group, are greedy. So they govern, and even those good legislators, they come through my Republican men's club all the time, and they have all these really good ideas and high principles, and then they get there and they get co-opted. And I do blame a lot of that on the lobbying process.
Well, when you think about it, you know, regular people are out working.
That's right.
When you go to the Capitol, it's surrounded by organizations that take money from the Capitol. And I don't care how good a politician is, when you send them to the state Capitol or even Washington, 24/7, they're surrounded by people who want something from you, want some sort of spending. So even good people, after a while, it wears you down, which is why TABOR is that check and balance that says, fine, you can get worn down all you like, and you can spend all the money's there, but if you want more than what's there, you're going to have to come to us and ask.
And more is in the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. The logic is if population grows 4%, the government needs 4% more money to service that. If inflation goes up 2%, the same way. So that'll go up 6% without anybody doing anything, unless they want to cut it back. But go ahead.
Right. So bringing it over What was the impetus to put together this remarkably lengthy report?
78 pages.
78 pages. 72 of them are footnotes. So what, after studying this and looking at TABOR, looking at it through a historic perspective and a constitutional perspective, what's your verdict, counselor?
Counselor?
A qualified success. What the book does is it takes TABOR, it puts it in context, so you get to see why it's not a unique measure and why it very much is in the American tradition of limiting the fiscal powers of government. Secondly, it takes a snapshot of where TABOR is today. It explains what it was originally and how it's changed over the years from court decisions and other effects. And then it contains recommendations that identify the weaknesses of TABOR and explores ways to compensate for those weaknesses, and also the strengths of TABOR, and explores ways to build on those strengths. So that's the basic impetus for the
you say a qualified success.
Yeah.
Let's go into that success. The part that people seem to hate the most, when I say people, I'm talking about the Takings Coalition, is that when government gets too much revenue over and above population and inflation, they got to do something they don't want to do. They got to give it back. Or, heaven forbid, they actually have to go and ask, can we keep it? Can we keep what's there? But they don't ever want to ask, because if they ask, we have this tendency to go, what did you do with the first part of it? Yeah. And I remember the first big refunds we got. This was in the early 1990s.
$3.2 billion.
$3.2 billion. And I remember so well when people were getting their money back from TABOR on the state level. The Takings Coalition was screaming, look at California, look at these other states. They're enjoying this growth dividend that's coming in so they can invest in schools and invest in here, invest and invest and invest, and we're being held behind. And amazingly, after that, we hit our first bust, and the recession hit. And so we kept giving the money back, which meant our budget stayed here. California went up to here, and when the recession hit, they came plummeting down, and we just had a tiny little step. It saved us from a horrific budget experience. Do I have how right am I on that?
No, that's right on, and we're still waiting for a thank you on that. I'd like to amplify one other thing you said. I've been looking into lobbying because I think there's a real disparity, and one of our speakers was the lady that takes care of the lobbyist records. And I said, when I want you to speak, just give me some initial information. Tell me the top 10 lobbyists and how much they make, because she knows that. She has that. And so she sent back the top 10, look like companies, but most of them are individuals, and they make together $7 million. I said, okay, what's the big picture? This is 2014 General Assembly. She said, yeah, they're making now $40 million. I said, well, how many of them are there? And it sounds a little biblical, but she said 666. So it goes back to you. They go through us to get voted in, and then they're up there. I call it, they're up there at the castle with the moat around it and the alligators in the swamp, and we're not there. We're out working, thinking they're going to do what we want them to do.
Rob says it's a qualified success. You've done a great report, first on the first decade and then the second decade of TABOR. Tell me, after two and a half decades, what has TABOR done for us, and what's been the biggest failure?
Well, TABOR hasn't failed at all. It's the people the ones that want the money, and they're good at it. They have our money to work with, and they know it's a very good investment because, like when Amendment 71 passed, they got a free ride now. It's back to before TABOR. And before TABOR, just an example, the 10 years before TABOR, the inflation plus population was 50%, so the growth should have been 50%. The state of Colorado grew 134%, almost three times.
The state budget
The
grew.
state spending,
right.
Not the budget. And then I call it the rose between two thorns. The first decade of TABOR, it was almost level. They were so confounded by it that they didn't know how to handle it, so they followed it. And it was
TABOR.
It was a beautiful thing. And then then they started figuring out how to nip around the edges, Amendment C, and then it just went
Right.
went wrong.
When it is amazing. I think the courts here have eviscerated in such things as if it's a fee, it doesn't go into TABOR. So all we need to do is call things a fee. If we're supposed to ask permission of the voters in order to increase debt, well, if we call debt a certificate of participation, which is just debt, the courts say you don't need to ask permission. And as you mentioned now, we have more of our state budget is outside of the bounds of TABOR than is inside the bound of TABOR. And our governor and some Democrats want to push the hospital provider fee to even get more of it outside. Is it fair to say TABOR is not what we voted for and that it has been changed?
Oh yeah, it's been changed in a number of different ways. Its revenue control mechanisms, for example, have largely broken down. This, by the way, is not unusual. I mentioned earlier that TABOR is one of many tax and expenditure limitation provisions that states have adopted throughout the years, and people look at these and what they found is that a tax and expenditure limitation, like TABOR, has a life expectancy of about 5 years. It takes about 5 years for people to get around it. Now, it took a lot longer, as Fred just pointed out, for them to find a way to get around TABOR. And so that's the success part of the expression
We're running out of
qualified
time.
success.
You also have some suggestions. What should happen to TABOR to bring it back to what it should be? What is it? What's the recommendation? What's the repair?
Okay, let me just mention two, because there are a bunch of them. Number one is I think we need to restore the revenue limits that were largely lifted by Referendum C. The purpose of TABOR is not just to have public votes, it's also to limit the size of government and give the private sector a chance to expand. So that's one thing I would recommend. The other and perhaps most radical recommendation is that I think we should consider establishing a new court in Colorado, as some other states have, a specialized court that deals with financial affairs, commercial affairs, and has the training and the ability to get things right. One thing I would recommend is not all the members of that court be lawyers, that they be people who understand the philosophy and the need for tax limitation so that they can consider these cases in a more objective way.
Is there an analogy in another area of law that has a separate court?
Oh yeah, many. The Delaware Court of Chancery, the Commercial Court of Pennsylvania, the Family Court of New York, the Surrogates Court of New York,
the
and
Kangaroo Court of Colorado?
I don't know if we've had any of those recently, but we certainly have had some very disturbing decisions come out of the Supreme Court. You mentioned earlier that originally it was Amendment 1. The state Supreme Court seems to dislike TABOR so much they won't even call it TABOR. 25 years after it was passed, they still call it Amendment 1 because there's something about the term Taxpayer Bill of Rights.
Those nasty taxpayers.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much for this. If people want both of these, just go to independenceinstitute.org. And don't worry, the fight continues. Stay tuned.